The warning died on her lips the moment his eyes met hers, not with the hunger she'd learned to expect from men, but with something that made her chest tighten in ways she couldn't name. June Cassidy had spent 25 years perfecting the art of being untouchable, her father's daughter wrapped in thorns and gunpowder, yet here stood a crow warrior whose gentle smile unraveled every defense she'd built. In the Montana wilderness, where mercy was a luxury few could afford, she'd stumbled into the one man who might teach her that some touches heal instead of wound. Subscribe to discover if a heart built for war can learn to beat for love. The rope burns on June's wrists had stopped bleeding, but the humiliation still burned fresh as prairie fire. 3 days bound to a saddle, 3 days of bounty hunters' rough hands and rougher words, 3 days of being called Cassidy's brat, like it was a curse instead of a name. She'd escaped during the river crossing, slipping her bonds while they argued over her father's bounty, but freedom in Crow territory felt more like jumping from the frying pan into the flames. The Montana wilderness stretched endless around her, all sage and stone and sky so wide it made her feel small as a lost bullet. Her boots squelched through the muddy riverbank, each step a reminder that she was alone in ways that went deeper than geography. 25 years of being Blackjack Cassidy's daughter had taught her that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, that every smile hid a knife, every kindness came with a price. The ghost town where her father's gang holed up felt like another lifetime now. All those weathered faces and whispered plans, all that talk of loyalty that meant nothing when the law came calling. She'd learned early that even family could turn on you if the price was right, learned to sleep with one eye open and her hand on her gun. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze, every muscle coiled tight as a rattlesnake ready to strike. Through the cottonwoods came a rider, and June's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. Not a bounty hunter. The horse was too fine, the rider's posture too proud, his long black hair catching the afternoon light like spilled ink. Crow warrior had to be, which meant she'd traded one kind of danger for another. Her father's stories echoed in her memory, tales of savage raids and scalping knives, though looking at this man, she wondered if those stories had been just another lie in a lifetime full of them. He dismounted with fluid grace, his movements careful and deliberate, like he was approaching a wounded animal that might bolt or bite. June's hand found the grip of her father's Colt, the weight of it familiar as her own heartbeat, but something in the stranger's dark eyes made her hesitate. No hunger there, no calculation, just a quiet intensity that seemed to see straight through her defenses to the frightened girl beneath. When he spoke, his voice was low and warm as whiskey by a winter fire, asking in careful English if she was hurt, if she needed help, words that hit her like physical blows, because kindness was the one weapon she'd never learned to defend against. The afternoon sun painted everything gold and amber, the river singing its ancient song, the wind carrying scents of sage and sweetgrass that made her think of things she'd never had: peace, safety, home. But June Cassidy was her father's daughter, raised on suspicion and schooled in survival, and she knew better than to trust a pretty face or gentle words. Men wanted things from her, always had, whether it was information about her father's hideouts or something darker that made her skin crawl. This crow warrior might speak soft, might look at her like she was something precious instead of something to be used, but she'd learned that the cruelest traps were often baited with kindness. Yet as she stood there in the dying light, her whole body aching from days of rough treatment, something deep inside her chest began to crack like ice in spring thaw. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the way he kept his distance, hands visible, posture non-threatening, or maybe it was just that she was so tired of being afraid, so tired of carrying her father's sins like stones in her pockets. The warning she'd been taught to give, "If you touch me, you'll regret it," felt suddenly hollow, a child's bravado in the face of something she didn't understand, something that might not require armor at all. Kale had seen wounded creatures before, deer caught in snares, horses broken by cruel masters, but something about this white woman's eyes reminded him of a hawk he'd once found with a shattered wing, fierce and beautiful and ready to die fighting rather than accept help. She stood there by the river like a cornered wildcat, all sharp edges and barely contained violence, her father's reputation hanging around her like smoke from a dying fire. The bounty hunter's trail was easy enough to read in the mud and broken branches, their carelessness written in every trampled flower and scattered stone, but it was the rope burns on her wrists that made something cold and hard settle in his chest. His grandmother had taught him that some hurts went deeper than flesh, that the worst wounds were the ones that couldn't be seen, and looking at June Cassidy, he could read a lifetime of such injuries in the way she held herself. 25 years of being Blackjack Cassidy's daughter had carved lines of wariness around her green eyes, had taught her to flinch before the blow landed, to expect cruelty as naturally as sunrise. The stories his people told about her father painted him as a devil in human skin, all greed and violence and casual brutality, but this woman, trembling by the water's edge, looked more like his victim than his accomplice. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough as sandpaper, demanding to know what he wanted, what his price would be, because everything had a price in her world and kindness was just another currency to be traded. Kale felt something twist in his chest at the resignation in her tone, the way she seemed to be calculating what she could afford to lose, what pieces of herself she might have to sacrifice to buy safe passage. He'd grown up in a world where honor meant something, where a man's word was his bond and protecting the helpless was sacred duty, but her world had clearly taught her different lessons. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, and Kale knew she couldn't survive a night alone in this country, not with bounty hunters on her trail and winter coming on fast. His hunting camp was only a few miles upstream, a sheltered spot where the river bent around a stand of ancient pines, where his grandmother's spirit still seemed to whisper in the wind. It would be easy enough to take her there, to offer food and warmth and safety, but he could see in her eyes that such gifts would feel like chains to someone who'd learned that every kindness came with hidden costs. So instead, he did something that seemed to surprise them both. He stepped back, giving her space to breathe, to think, to choose. His horse nickered softly, sensing the tension in the air, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out as if calling to its mate. The river kept singing its eternal song, indifferent to human pain and human hope, while two strangers stood on its banks trying to bridge a gap wider than the water between them. Kale had tracked wounded animals before, knew that sometimes the kindest thing was to let them come to you in their own time, on their own terms. When June finally looked up at him, really looked, he saw something flicker in her green eyes that might have been hope, fragile as a candle flame in a storm. She was beautiful in the way of wild things, all untamed spirit and fierce independence, but it was the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide that made his heart ache. Her father's blood might run in her veins, but Kale could see that she was nothing like the monster who'd sired her, could see the goodness buried beneath layers of hurt and mistrust like gold hidden in dark earth. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky when she finally nodded, a barely perceptible movement that somehow felt like the most important victory of his life. Trust, he knew, would have to be earned one careful moment at a time, like gentling a wild horse or coaxing a frightened child from hiding. But something in the way she looked at him suggested that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to stop running from the possibility that not all men were monsters, that some touches could heal instead of harm. The morning sun painted the water gold as Kale led her to the river's edge, his movements deliberate and unhurried, like a man who understood that healing could not be rushed. June followed at a distance that spoke of years spent calculating escape routes, her hand never straying far from the knife at her hip, though something in her posture had softened since the night before. The sound of rushing water filled the silence between them, a constant murmur that seemed to wash away the need for words, and she found herself studying the way he moved, not with the predatory grace of the men she'd known, but with something that reminded her of the way her mother used to tend wounded birds. When he knelt by the water's edge and cupped his hands to drink, she noticed the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles, old wounds that spoke of battles fought and survived, yet his touch remained gentle as he gestured for her to join him. The water was cold against her palms, shocking in its purity, and as she drank, she caught her reflection wavering in the current. A stranger's face, softer somehow than the one she remembered, as if proximity to his quiet strength was already beginning to erode the hard edges she'd spent years building. "Your father," Kyle said quietly, his voice barely audible above the water's song. "He taught you that the world would try to break you." It wasn't a question, and June felt something twist in her chest at the casual way he spoke of wounds she'd never named aloud, as if he could read the map of her scars written in the defensive set of her shoulders. She wanted to deny it, to spit back some cutting response that would restore the distance between them, but the words died in her throat as she watched him trail his fingers through the current, his dark eyes reflecting an understanding that went deeper than sympathy. "My grandmother," he continued, "she used to say that some people are born into storms, and they forget that the sun exists until someone shows them how to stop running from the light." Mdrum. The metaphor hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross, and June found herself remembering her mother's voice, soft and broken, whispering that love was just another word for weakness, another way for the world to find your soft spots and press until you bled. But here, with the morning light catching in Kyle's hair and the river singing its ancient song of renewal, those old truths felt less like gospel and more like the desperate lies of a woman who'd forgotten how to hope. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in a way that made June's chest ache with something she couldn't name, and she found herself studying the way the light played across his features, searching for the cruelty she'd been taught to expect from men who looked at her with interest. Instead, she saw only patience, the kind of steady presence that suggested he would wait as long as it took for her to decide whether she wanted to keep running or finally allow herself to rest. "You don't know me," she said finally, her voice rougher than she intended, and the words carried the weight of every wall she'd ever built, every door she'd ever slammed shut against the possibility of connection. Kyle turned to look at her then, his gaze direct but not demanding, and she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the torn fabric of her dress or the dirt beneath her fingernails. "I know enough," he replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested he'd seen through her defenses to the frightened girl beneath, the one who'd learned to bare her teeth because no one had ever taught her that she could simply smile. The admission hung between them like a confession, and June felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the armor she'd spent years perfecting, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wondered what it might feel like to let someone see her without her weapons drawn. When he stood and extended his hand to help her up, June stared at it for a long moment, knowing that this was more than a simple gesture of courtesy. It was an invitation to trust, to believe that not all touches ended in pain. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, warning her that kindness was just cruelty, wearing a prettier mask. But the calluses on Kyle's palm spoke of honest work, of hands that built rather than destroyed, and she found herself reaching out before her mind could catalogue all the reasons why this was dangerous. His grip was firm but gentle, warm in a way that sent unexpected heat racing up her arm, and as he pulled her to her feet, she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not the hungry possession she'd learned to fear, but something softer, more patient, like he was content to simply exist in her orbit without demanding anything in return. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, and June felt the familiar urge to run warring with something newer, more fragile. the treacherous hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found someone who wouldn't try to break her just to prove he could. When she didn't immediately pull away, Cale's thumb brushed across her knuckles, in a gesture so gentle it brought tears to her eyes, and she realized with startling clarity that this was what safety felt like. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who would stand between her and the world's sharp edges without asking for anything in return. The walk back to his camp was different somehow, the space between them charged with new understanding, and June found herself stealing glances at his profile, trying to reconcile this gentle giant with everything she'd been taught about men and their appetites. He moved through the landscape like he belonged to it, his steps sure and quiet, and she noticed the way birds didn't scatter at his approach, as if they recognized him as something other than a threat. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly, the question torn from her throat before she could stop it, and she hated the way her voice cracked on the words, revealing more vulnerability than she'd intended. Kyle paused, turning to face her with that same patient expression that made her feel simultaneously exposed and protected. And when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Because you asked me not to touch you," he said simply, "and then you let me anyway." The observation hit her like a physical blow, stripping away her pretenses with surgical precision, and June felt her carefully constructed walls crumble a little more, leaving her standing naked in the morning light with nothing but her racing heart and the terrifying possibility that she might actually be safe. For the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to stop fighting, to lay down her weapons and trust that someone else would keep watch while she rested. And the thought was so foreign, so impossibly sweet, that it brought fresh tears to her eyes and made her chest ache with longing for something she'd never dared to want. The afternoon heat pressed down on them like a living thing as they reached Kyle's temporary camp, a simple arrangement of blankets and supplies tucked beneath the shade of ancient cottonwoods that had witnessed generations of travelers seeking refuge from the merciless sun. June stood at the edge of the clearing, her body tense with the old familiar readiness to bolt, watching as he moved about the space with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, and she found herself cataloguing escape routes, even as part of her whispered that maybe, for once, she didn't need them. The sound of her stomach growling broke the silence, a betrayal of the hunger she'd been ignoring for days, and when Kyle glanced up from where he was building a small fire, his expression held no judgment, only the quiet concern of someone who understood what it meant to go without. "When did you last eat?" he asked, his voice carrying the same gentle authority she'd noticed before, and June felt her cheeks burn with shame at the admission that she couldn't remember, that survival had reduced her to stealing scraps and drinking from streams like some wild thing. He didn't press for details, didn't demand explanations for the hollows beneath her cheekbones or the way her clothes hung loose on her frame, and his restraint felt like a gift she wasn't sure she deserved. Instead, he simply began preparing food with the same patient care he'd shown her, his movements economical and sure, and she found herself mesmerized by the sight of his hands working, the way they handled even the simplest tasks, with a reverence that spoke of someone who understood the value of sustenance, of care, of the small rituals that made survival into something approaching life. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a blanket spread in the shade, and the word was an invitation rather than a command. Though June felt the weight of her exhaustion settling into her bones like lead as she finally allowed herself to acknowledge how long she'd been running on nothing but fear and stubbornness. The blanket was soft beneath her, worn smooth by use, and as she settled onto it, she caught the faint scent of sage and wood smoke that seemed to cling to everything Kyle touched, a masculine fragrance that was somehow both wild and comforting. He worked in companionable silence, occasionally glancing her way with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much, and June found herself studying his profile in the dappled light, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he bent over the fire, the unconscious grace with which he moved through even the most mundane tasks. There was something hypnotic about watching him, something that made her feel drowsy and safe in a way she hadn't experienced since childhood, and she had to fight the urge to let her guard down completely, to surrender to the exhaustion that pulled at her like an undertow. When he handed her a plate of simple food, bread and dried meat, nothing fancy but prepared with care, their fingers brushed, and she felt that same electric shock of connection that made her breath catch and her heart stutter against her ribs. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words carried more weight than gratitude for food, encompassing everything he'd given her in the space of a day. Safety, gentleness, the radical gift of being seen without being judged. The food was better than anything she'd tasted in months, or maybe it was just that she was finally allowing herself to enjoy something without constantly scanning for threats, and as she ate, she became aware of Kyle watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Not hunger, not possession, but something softer. Satisfaction, maybe, at seeing her nourished, as if her well-being mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with what she could give him in return. The realization was both terrifying and intoxicating, this evidence that someone might care for her without expecting payment, and June felt another piece of her armor crack and fall away, leaving her more exposed, but somehow lighter. "You don't have to watch me like I might disappear," she said, attempting levity, but hearing the tremor in her own voice. And Cale's smile in response was like sunrise after the longest night, warm and gentle and full of promise. "Old habit," he admitted, his honesty disarming in its simplicity. "Beautiful things have a way of vanishing when you're not paying attention." The compliment hit her like a physical blow, not because it was flowery or false, but because it was delivered with such matter-of-fact sincerity that she couldn't dismiss it as manipulation or flattery. He thought she was beautiful, not despite her scars and sharp edges, but including them, as if her damage was just another facet of something worth treasuring. The thought made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name, and she had to look away, focusing on her food to hide the tears that threatened to spill over and betray just how starved she'd been for exactly this kind of gentle regard. When she finished eating, the exhaustion she'd been holding at bay crashed over her like a wave, and June found herself swaying where she sat, her eyelids heavy with the weight of too many sleepless nights and the strange safety of Kyle's presence. "Rest," he said softly, and she wanted to protest, to insist that she couldn't afford to let her guard down, but her body was already betraying her, muscles relaxing despite her mind's protests. "I'll keep watch," he added, and something in his tone, the absolute certainty, the quiet strength, made her believe him in a way that defied logic and experience. She lay down on the blanket, hyper-aware of his proximity, of the way he settled nearby but not too close, respecting the boundaries she'd drawn, even as he offered protection. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was his silhouette against the afternoon sky, solid and reassuring, and for the first time in years, June allowed herself to drift off without one hand on her weapon, trusting that someone else would stand guard over her dreams. In her sleep, she didn't dream of running or hiding or fighting for her life. Instead, she dreamed of gentle hands and patient eyes, of a voice that spoke her name like a prayer, and when she stirred hours later to find a blanket tucked carefully around her shoulders, she realized that safety might not be a luxury she couldn't afford, but a necessity she'd been denying herself for far too long. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Cale was still there, still watching, still waiting, with the infinite patience of someone who understood that trust was not given, but earned, one gentle gesture at a time. Evening painted the sky in shades of amber and rose as June woke to find herself cocooned in warmth, the blanket around her shoulders carrying Cale's scent and the lingering heat of his body. evidence that he'd covered her while she slept with the same careful tenderness he'd shown her since their first meeting. The fire had been built up while she dozed, casting dancing shadows across the clearing, and she could see him silhouetted against the flames, his profile strong and patient as he worked on something she couldn't quite make out. For a moment, she simply lay still, allowing herself the luxury of watching him unobserved, noting the way the firelight caught in his dark hair and the unconscious grace with which he moved. And she felt something shift inside her chest. Not the sharp crack of breaking, but the slow, sweet ache of something frozen finally beginning to thaw. The realization that she'd slept deeply, without nightmares or the constant vigilance that had become second nature, should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a strange sense of wonder, as if she'd forgotten what it felt like to truly rest and was only now remembering. When she stirred, sitting up and pushing the hair back from her face, Cale looked up from his work with a smile that was like coming home to a place she'd never been but had always been searching for, warm and welcoming and completely without expectation. "Better?" he asked, and the simple question carried layers of meaning, not just about her physical rest, but about the walls she'd been carrying, the weight she'd been bearing alone for so long that she'd forgotten it was possible to set it down. "I dreamed," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them, and she was surprised by the wonder in her own voice, as if peaceful sleep was a miracle she'd forgotten could happen. Cale's expression softened further, if such a thing were possible, and he set aside whatever he'd been working on to give her his full attention, the simple act of being truly seen and heard making her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. "Good dreams?" he asked. And June found herself nodding, remembering fragments of warmth and safety, of hands that touched without taking, of a voice that spoke her name like something precious rather than a curse to be spat out in anger. The admission felt dangerous, like revealing a weakness that could be exploited, but Cale's face showed only quiet satisfaction, as if her peace was something he'd been hoping for, working toward with the same patient dedication he brought to everything else. "You were working on something," she observed, deflecting attention from her own vulnerability, and when he held up the object in his hands, she felt her breath catch in her throat. It was a small carving, rough but recognizable, the shape of a bird in flight, its wings spread wide as if reaching for freedom. "For you," he said simply, offering it to her with the same careful reverence he'd shown when touching her hand, and June stared at the gift with something approaching awe, unable to remember the last time someone had made something just for her, just because they wanted to see her smile. The carving was warm from his hands when she took it, the wood smooth beneath her fingers, and she could see the care that had gone into every curve, every delicate detail that spoke of hours spent thinking about her, about what might bring her joy. "Why a bird?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and Kyle's answer came without hesitation, as if he'd been waiting for the question. "Because you're meant to fly," he said, and the simple statement hit her like a physical blow, stripping away every defense she'd ever built and leaving her raw and exposed in the firelight. No one had ever seen her as anything but her father's daughter, the outlaw's child, the dangerous woman with blood on her hands and violence in her heritage. But Kyle looked at her and saw potential for flight, for freedom, for something beautiful and untethered by the weight of her past. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, years of suppressed emotion pouring out of her like water from a broken dam, and she clutched the carving to her chest as if it could anchor her to this moment, to this feeling of being seen and valued for something other than her capacity for destruction. "I don't know how," she sobbed, the admission torn from her throat like a confession, and Cale moved closer, not touching but close enough that she could feel his warmth, his solid presence a comfort in the storm of her breaking. "You don't have to know," he said gently, his voice steady and sure in the face of her tears. "You just have to want to try." The space between them seemed to shimmer with possibility as June struggled to compose herself, wiping her face with the back of her hand and trying to rebuild the walls that had served her so well for so long, but finding them somehow insubstantial now, like trying to construct barriers from smoke and shadow. Kyle waited with the infinite patience she was beginning to recognize as one of his defining characteristics, not pushing or demanding but simply being present, offering his strength without trying to diminish hers. "I've done terrible things," she said finally, the words a test, a challenge, a last desperate attempt to make him see her as the world had taught her to see herself, as something broken and dangerous and unworthy of the gentleness he offered so freely. But Kyle's expression didn't change, didn't harden with judgment or soften with pity, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "So have I," he said simply. "The question isn't what we've done, but what we choose to do now." The statement hung between them like a bridge, an invitation to step away from the past and into something new, something that didn't require her to be anything other than exactly who she was in this moment, scared and hopeful and desperately wanting to believe that redemption was possible. "I don't know how to be anything but what I am," she whispered, and Kyle's smile was like dawn breaking over the mountains, full of promise and new beginnings. "Then be that," he said, reaching out slowly, telegraphing his intention so clearly that she had time to pull away if she wanted to, but instead finding herself leaning into his touch as his fingers brushed the tears from her cheek with a reverence that made her feel like something sacred rather than something broken. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like the brutal taking she'd learned to expect from men who wanted her. Instead, it was a question asked with lips and breath, a gentle exploration that waited for her answer before deepening, and June found herself responding with a hunger that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with the desperate need to be known, to be accepted, to be loved, not despite her damage, but including it. His hands framed her face with the same careful reverence he'd shown the wooden bird, as if she were something precious that might break if handled roughly, and she could taste the salt of her own tears on his lips, could feel the steady beat of his heart against her chest as he pulled her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, June felt fundamentally changed, as if something essential had shifted inside her chest, making room for possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. "Stay," Kyle whispered against her forehead, the word both plea and promise, and June found herself nodding before her mind could catalogue all the reasons why this was dangerous, why trusting him was foolish, why letting herself hope was the cruelest thing she could do to her own heart. "Stay," she echoed, and the word felt like a vow, like the first step on a journey towards something she couldn't name but desperately wanted to find. In the firelight, with his arms around her and the wooden bird clutched in her hand, June Cassidy finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worth saving after all, and that the gentle warrior who held her might be exactly the person to show her how to fly.